Deplorable cisgender Thomas Jefferson and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer, and Jonah Small is joining us as well. Welcome, Jonah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this podcast is called, you heard it correctly, Deplorable Cisgender Thomas Jefferson. And we do have the dumbest bill in America. So first up, podcast listeners, other than welcoming Jonah Small to the podcast, who is, by the way, a millennial, New York City is going to remove Thomas Jefferson from City Hall. Yes, podcast listeners, you heard that correctly. New York City, according to Fox News, The Hill magazine, CNN, all of the news channels, New York City is going to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson from City Hall. And here's the article. New York City Commission on Monday voted to remove a statue of Thomas Jefferson from City Hall, reports ABC 7 News in New York. New York City Public Design Commission voted unanimously to relocate the 188-year-old statue located in the building's city council chambers. The move is a result of a years-long debate stemming from the fact that the former president was a slave owner. In June, members of the city council, including Council Speaker Corey Johnson, penned a letter to New York City Mayor de Blasio calling for the statue's removal. Quote, "There are disturbing images of divisiveness and racism in our city that need to be revisited immediately," the letter said, according to NBC News. That starts with City Hall. De Blasio on Thursday, during a press briefing, told reporters he understood why Jefferson's past profoundly bothers people and why he would find that to be something that they couldn't ignore. And so as you can imagine, the article goes on and on to justify the fact that Thomas Jefferson, Jonah, should be removed from City Hall in New York because of the fact that he owned slaves.
So I'm curious, like the biggest aspect for me is why is there no middle ground with this? Why are they not opening it up to, hey, let's put a plaque on here to notate the positives and the negatives and let people educate themselves on the history of this person? And why are we just removing it entirely?
Yeah.
You know,
so why are we removing it entirely? Why don't we actually have a conversation with the public as well as the entire city of New York, maybe the United States of America? We don't want to have a conversation, though. The left doesn't. The left just wants to cancel by removing statues. And here's my point. And I brought up podcast listeners and for Jonah and everybody else out there, the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, obviously penned by him and signed on July 4th of 1776. And just want to read the first paragraph and a half. Okay. And if you are offended by Thomas Jefferson, then you obviously don't really understand world history, not just American history. You would actually have to understand world history and what inspired Jefferson to write this declaration. By the way, an incredibly landmark piece of literature, if you will, and documenting the human experience. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And here it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, you know, all these people did a lot of good. And I think it's tough for me to see that. I don't think that anybody put these statues in place or made these with the intent of showing that this person was a slave owner or they did these terrible things. And so then to remove it for that reason just doesn't make any sense to me, at least without trying to find that middle ground that I was talking about of maybe let's just do a better job of educating people that this was a person who made a lot of mistakes, who might have done wrong things, but made leaps and bounds for our country when we were coming off the ground. And so it's sad to see that all of it gets removed just for one bad thing, when I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that doesn't have any faults, especially in politics these days. And so
you mean the council members in de Blasio are so virtuous in New York that, they can decide Thomas Jefferson has to be removed?
Yeah. I mean, apparently so. They're not in the limelight. And I think it's more of it's just them trying to show some political action that they're stepping forward and doing something good, as opposed to recognizing this person has done far more for our country probably than they have. And not trying to find a middle ground to acknowledge the good and the bad.
But what's interesting too is government. These people believe in New York, the council and the mayor, they believe in New York that government is all knowing and all powerful. And that's the way it should be. And what they are missing with Thomas Jefferson, when you remove Jefferson from the conversation, moving forward, when you remove Thomas Jefferson from the conversation, what you're removing is the same individual that said, you have certain unalienable rights, and they are granted to you not by government. They're granted to you by God, and they cannot be taken away. Government needs to be formed by men, of course, now women too, but obviously in that day it was men. Government needs to be formed by men, according to Thomas Jefferson, because that's who has to form government. You have to be able to govern yourself in some way, but you have the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And those unalienable rights that you have come from God, cannot be taken away from government. If you remove Thomas Jefferson from the conversation, aren't you essentially saying that now your rights come from government?
Yeah, well, and I think that speaks back to that. That's probably why that statue was created in the first place. That's why that was put there, is to acknowledge that. And so removing it just for one reason that had nothing to do with the creation and acknowledgement of what he's put forward for the country, I think is moving in the wrong direction. And it's not even in a location, I think, that like has a ton of traffic. People are looking at it all the time. This is just a statement.
It is. It's a statement. It's removing him. This is my concern, right? Because these are individuals who probably have never actually studied anything beyond the immediate simple aspects of American history. These members of the council in New York, and de Blasio, of course, he's probably the dumbest mayor in America. But they certainly haven't discussed and studied world history. And of course, if you take Jefferson back to the context in world history, these are gentlemen, the founders, such as Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who wanted to separate themselves from places where governments were all powerful, because you had kings. Yeah. You had kings, you had queens. These people, what they said, they basically gave an edict, and that was the way it was going to be.
Right.
There was no due process. There was no voting them out.
Yeah.
Well, you get rid of Thomas Jefferson, who broke that cycle with the Declaration of Independence. And then what are you saying? You're saying, well, from this day forward, there is no God. Government is God, and you do whatever we tell you to do.
Well, and I'm curious to know, does this kind of go back to the old adage of the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? Is this coming from a mass opinion of people who generally agree with this? Or is this coming from a few people that are loud enough to make something happen? And I'm more inclined to believe that that's what's happening. It's just that we have a group of people that find this offensive, that are trying to get it removed, and the general masses, I think, maybe just don't have a strong enough opinion to get out there and speak on it and say, well, maybe it's better to have education on this and recognize the positive nature of it. And they're not out there saying that.
You know what? Jefferson would not be removed from the city hall if he were a transgender. I'm convinced. If he were a transgender and he had slaves, but he also wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Well, maybe we can find one of those pictures where he's got a wig on.
Right, they did wear wigs, so maybe they were transgenders.
Yeah.
That should be the conservative talking point now. These guys were actually transgenders, so they need to be preserved.
Yeah,
and
we just need to add a wig to the statue.
I like that. Next up, podcast listeners, West Virginia, deplorables beware. You won't believe this story. So get this. So a Democrat representative, of course, says West Virginia's economy is irrelevant following Senator Manchin's green energy criticisms. So Democrat Illinois Representative Sean Casten blasted West Virginia's economy as irrelevant, following criticisms from the state's Democrat Senator Joe Manchin of the Build Back Better Act's chief climate provision, the Clean Energy Performance Program. If you came and said to me, quote, "We will pass the CEPP as written, but we will exempt West Virginia from it," I would take that deal. Do I think that's possible? I mean, probably not, but that would be acceptable, right? Because West Virginia is an irrelevant part of our economy, Casten told Politico on Monday. So, of course, in West Virginia...
Don't they do a lot of coal? They do.
Yes. Coal and natural gas in West Virginia. Those are two massive industries.
Yeah.
So, of course, Manchin is like, I don't want there to be mandates which put our economy basically into a depression, a Great Depression.
Right.
And so this guy from Illinois, this Democrat congressman, is like, well, why would it matter anyway? Your economy is irrelevant to the United States of America and irrelevant to the world. But what does that say? What is he saying about the people of West Virginia when you say that kind of thing too?
Yeah.
So now, podcast listeners, you have to understand something. Jonas Small is in the renewable energy business, so we have to catch him on this because the Build Back Better plan has all kinds of things in it. Let's face it, everything from forcing people to not show IDs, the opposite of what common sense would be, and of course allowing people who are illegal to vote, all the way to the climate stuff, right? So let's speak a little bit about this climate stuff and what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that I think there needs to be a discussion on the humane and ethical aspect of some of these changes across the country where, working in the battery field and working in renewables, I think that is where things will end up shifting over the next 20 years. It just will. But along that transition, there needs to be a discussion of how we humanely do that for people that are not working in that industry. Because even if you start shifting over to manufacturing of solar panels and batteries, that's not something that can provide the workforce that something like coal or mining can. And losing those people and destroying those economies, even though that might be where we're going in the future, it's not the right thing to do right off the bat. And I don't.
So what you're saying is it's not a good idea to have legislation that puts hundreds of thousands of people out of work,
right?
Until such time as the economy can handle the transition, because there's a transition period, and you allow the transition period to work itself out, as opposed to forcing the change on people immediately and then putting people out of work.
Yeah, where it comes down to what's your metric of success? Is your metric to shift to renewables? Is it to shift to a profit, right? But along the way, is there a discussion of is this ethical for the people that are in this field right now? And I think that everyone gets so gung-ho about trying to implement this super quickly that they don't talk about that aspect. And it sounds like they're doing the same thing where they're writing off an entire state's economy, jobs for people.
And the people of the state. Yeah. You're basically saying to the people of the state, you are a bunch of deplorables. It's Hillary Clinton all over again. You don't matter. You are deplorables. And here's what's interesting about the geography of the United States, the political geography that a lot of people don't understand, is West Virginia spills over into many nearby states where portions of those states are more like West Virginia than the rest of the other states. So in my home state of Maryland, the entire western part of Maryland is much more like West Virginia than it is the rest of Maryland. The same thing applies to the western part of Pennsylvania. And the same thing applies to parts of Ohio. And, you can go on and on and on. So don't these individuals understand that when they make these blanket statements, they're touching large segments of blue collar America and telling them they don't matter?
Yeah. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I just, I wish that they would have more of an open discussion where, in politics as a leader, you're supposed to be working for the people and helping them. And so to draw a firm boundary around West Virginia and say these people are not worth it to even consider, I don't think that you're doing your job of working for people. It's not what it sounds like to me.
It's good to hear a millennial opinion on that. So get this, podcast listeners. Along the same lines, CNN goes the first 2 weeks of October without any program that they are airing, reaching more than 1 million viewers. So the liberal network, CNN, it's really not liberal, it's really progressive, has gone 21 days without averaging a single 7-digit viewership. This is big stuff, okay? Because CNN was really a growing network under Donald Trump. or at least it was holding its own because Trump naturally just really made people angry. And so they would watch CNN and MSNBC because they blasted Trump constantly 24/7. But there's no Donald Trump now. And the Biden agenda seems to be floundering, if not potentially failing. And CNN made all these promises to their viewers about how things were going to change. We're going to have change. It hasn't happened. So people are stopped watching. Do you watch CNN?
No, I don't.
What do you watch?
I don't watch much of anything. I think a lot of what I've shifted to is the podcast, YouTube videos, going out and trying to find my own information. And I think a lot of people are worried about, right? Like, what's the viability of the news that I'm getting? How filtered is it? And so I think more people are shifting to look through other avenues. And it sounds like CNN is having some trouble managing that. Well, I mean, they operate off of conflict, right? They operate off of a problem. And if there's no problem,
explain that for the viewers, because I think and the listeners, I think that's pretty cool.
Well, I think at least what I've noticed personally, and by no means am I super experienced in politics, but anytime I've tuned into the news, Fox News, CNN, a lot of these big networks are operating off of a wow factor, right? How much is there? How intense can we make this seem? And if there aren't these problems to confront or bring up and bring that wow factor in, people aren't interested in watching it. And so there's a lot of people in the US. And so for them to have viewership under 1 million is pretty sad.
So they're trying to get so what you're saying is mainstream media, including Fox, they try to get the outrage kind of issues out there to get people really upset. But what if the outrage issues are real? Like a congressman saying that the entire state of West Virginia is occupied by a bunch of deplorables and retrogrades because they have to make their living on coal and natural gas.
That's a good point. I mean, and for me, it's that they've built a status quo of that wow factor. And so then, even if you have something that's true or very important, I think it gets, in my mind, lost in the mix of it, where I think it's just another cry for viewership. And so I think if they can reduce that and say, hey, this is the standard news, but then when an actual event happens that is intense or that requires viewership, I think it would boost it for that and raise awareness.
Well,
but I don't think these news networks it sounds like they don't get viewership unless they push that. So I'm sure it's kind of a balance for them too.
You know what I think is interesting too is I think millennials are looking for information that is that has both sides.
Yeah, but I'm tired. I'm tired of seeing stuff like what CNN would put out, and I get tired of that massive conflict that's always going. And so yeah, I would personally love to see something that provides a little bit less bias
and provides more information, and then at least provides both sides, but not necessarily the yelling back and forth. Maybe actually providing information on both sides, and then you can make a decision.
Yeah.
Which is, by the way, that used to be the liberal mindset, right? You have opposite sides debate, and then you get closer to the truth as a result of it, as opposed to what we have today, which is, the yelling back and forth. So get this, podcast listeners: truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. So we talked about Superman last podcast, but and that was with Matt and Brian. But this podcast, we're going to talk about Superman because they've even changed the motto. So Superman, it used to be truth, justice, and the American way. But according to Variety magazine, which would probably know because they report on all of these kinds of Hollywood kind of things, it's now truth, justice, and a better tomorrow, says the DC Comics chief. So Superman is officially moving on from the American way. Jim Lee, chief creative officer and publisher of DC, announced on Saturday during the virtual fan event, DC Fandom, that the Man of Steel's motto will be evolving from the well-known mantra that he fights for truth, justice, and the American way. Superman's new mission statement, truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. In a press statement, the company said the decision is meant to better reflect the storylines that we are telling across DC and to honor Superman's incredible legacy of over 80 years of building a better world. In reality, Superman has followed several mantras over the decades, all of which involve variations on truth and justice on central to the iconic superhero's identity. In fact, truth, justice, and the American way did not originate with the first Superman comic books by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Instead, the saying came from a Superman radio serial in the early 40s as a way to cheer on the American military efforts in World War II. Oh, no, you mean Superman was actually, this guy that was pro-American, and that's not allowed anymore.
Yeah. Well, with those other slogan changes throughout the years, I don't think DC ever came out and publicly announced, hey, this is what we're changing, and so it sounds like the same thing where you have the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? These companies that come out and say, we're changing this stuff. We're trying to appease everybody. They're hoping for a better viewership and a better view from the public. And
so they want a global audience. They don't want, because the audience in China isn't going to watch. Well, they're probably not allowed to watch it anyway, but maybe they will now, because now it's not, instead of the American way, I
don't know. I get the impression that it's more for the American population in that change, almost like it's that they're trying to appease the people that are in America and in these countries that are viewing it, that it's not inclusive only to the US. But I think it's more of a cry for attention or hey, we're even across the board, just like what we talked about, right, with removing Thomas Jefferson. And they're
how so?
In that they're trying to come out as more politically sensitive. They're trying to come across as sensitive to people.
Do people care? Do millennials care whether it's sensitive?
I mean, I don't.
I mean, get this. Yeah. Variety magazine says, since then, however, the American way motto has fallen out of favor. Says who?
Yeah.
Variety magazine does. On the 1993 live action series Lois and Clark, Superman fought for truth and justice, full stop. And in the 2006 movie Superman Returns, starring Brandon Routh, I think that's how you say his name, Daily Planet editor-in-chief Perry White, Frank Langella, blithely asked Superman still fights for truth, justice, and all that stuff. I mean, basically, they're trying to poo-poo this whole idea.
Yeah, well, and that's where I wonder, who are they polling for this? I've never been polled for anything. I've never seen it come up. And so I don't know where that information's coming from, but where did Superman crash land, right? It was in the US. Where does he do everything? It's in the US. And so it's interesting to see them shift away from that. I think they're just trying to be careful.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the funny thing is that's one of the reasons podcast listeners were calling this podcast Deplorable Cisgender Thomas Jefferson. So maybe Superman was also a deplorable cisgender, but now that it's the better tomorrow instead of the American way, it's okay now. And then his son apparently is bi or something like that. We talked about that the other day. I mean, I'm sure that'll go over really well with Pete Buttigieg and his wife or husband, who just had a baby in a hospital, apparently, which we talked about yesterday, it's funny, your generation, and I'm not going to knock your generation, but your generation, it's like, I wonder often what they think when they see Pete Buttigieg, because we talked about this yesterday. Pete Buttigieg is in a hospital bed and he's got his husband and they're each holding one of the twins that they've obviously adopted, but the picture is one in which it makes you think, especially if you were, the woke class, that these two individuals just had these babies, that one of them gave birth to these twins in the hospital because they're sitting in a hospital bed.
I think it's funny. I think people are weird. I worked as a psychiatric nurse for 2 to 3 years before switching jobs. And the biggest thing I learned is that, people are weird, really weird. And so when I see things like that, I don't think it needs to be publicly announced or shown out, just like with Superman, right? With them announcing that his son is coming out as bi. I don't know that they necessarily need to announce it and show it off. I would be more comfortable with it just happening in the comic like it would in the natural world and let it be that. I don't think it needs to be flaunted. And it seems like that's what a lot of people are trying to do.
So psychiatric nurse. So yeah. Do you find anything psychiatrically wrong with two guys trying to give the impression that one just had a baby? Because this is one of the Democrat talking points now, by the way, certainly of the progressives in the Democrat Party, which is pretty much the entire party, namely that men can get pregnant and give birth. And they have said this, by the way. This is not...
They've said that men can give birth?
Yes, that men can get pregnant and men can have babies. Yeah. A number of Democrats have said that, including the former mayor of Austin, who ran for president of the United States, and a number of others, including one of them said it during the Democrat debate just last year in 2020.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, isn't that like, wouldn't that be kind of somewhat of a psychiatric issue? Don't you think that you actually believe that that's possible?
Yeah. And you kind of have to be careful with it in the sense of like, I've had patients come in that have body dysmorphia, or they have delusions that they are pregnant or they can have kids and things like that. But from a biological standpoint, no, a man cannot have a baby. Maybe if it was a transgender, man who had come from being a woman,
right,
they can certainly have a baby. But no,
exactly.
It's an interesting picture to paint, seeing two men in a hospital staged to look like they've had a child.
As we said before, if only Thomas Jefferson was a transgender, his statues across the country would be just fine. So next up, podcast listeners, Ohio college student is angry and scared after, quote, cisgender men installed radiators in their dorms, and it's a safe space. So I have to read this because this is a uniquely millennial story. A student at Oberlin College in Ohio, by the way, podcast listeners, it's a very difficult college to get into. It's a stellar liberal arts college, but incredibly far left, described being scared and angry after the school announced a work crew would be installing radiators in a safe space dormitory for women and trans students, explaining the crew would likely be cisgender men. So this is the college. The college is telling the individuals in this dormitory that there's going to be work done in their dorm, and the dorm is for women and trans students, and that the workmen who will be coming into their space to repair and replace radiators, which keep you warm, podcast listeners, in the wintertime, and it gets cold in Ohio, they're likely to be cisgender men. Quote, I was angry, scared, and confused. Why didn't the college complete the installation over the summer when the building was empty? Why couldn't they tell us precisely when the workers would be there? Why were they only notifying us the day before the installation was due to begin? Oberlin student Peter Frey Witzer wrote in an op-ed published in the college newspaper on Friday. I want to know the millennial opinion on this one.
There's just two things with that. It's that, the world keeps working, whether or not you don't like cisgender people or you don't like a certain kind of person. I don't like assholes, but they're out there, and these
what
people,
are you saying exactly?
And so looking at it from the way the world works, just from like a standpoint of we need to have this installed at the university, I think the university did their due diligence. They notified them that this is going to be happening, give you a chance to, if you don't want to be there, you don't have to be there, right? And from the second standpoint, it's that these people exist, you know what I mean? And I don't think that there's just...
What people exist? What do you mean?
Any kind of person.
You mean like
gay people, cisgender people?
They do exist.
They're all out there. And so if you don't want to put yourself in that situation, the university notified you that you don't need to be there when they do it.
Okay. Right?
And two, they're out there. People exist, and you're going to have to interact with them.
Radiators do have to be repaired. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
From time to time, radiators have to be repaired,
and from a standpoint of a business, you can't only hire non-cisgender people to go and do radiator repair at a certain location. It doesn't work.
I see a bill in the Maryland General Assembly. There's a bill. Yeah, right. Notification bill. Cisgender men entering the premises.
Yeah, just signs.
Notification requirements.
Yeah, go around and notify everybody. You shouldn't be here.
Well, maybe in that particular, dorm room in Oberlin College, they should have, instead of a coat rack, they should have a wig rack, so that when the cisgender men come in, they can like put on the wig, and then
it's a company uniform.
I mean, is it allowed? Can they show their butt crack when they're like trying to fix
they're bent
radiator?
over doing the repair? I find that offensive. Maybe they're. I should say they're not allowed to do that.
That can be incredibly offensive. I would agree with you.
Yeah, your hairy crack scares me. Yeah.
So, quote, in general, here's another student. Quote, in general, I'm very averse to people entering my personal space. This anxiety was compounded by the fact that the crew would be strangers and they were more than likely to be cisgender men.
Yeah, this just sounds to me like it's coming from one person. You know, I that's tough to talk about because it's like,
why are they so angry at men?
Well, they give such a voice to people that are extreme, right? And I think that's what we've seen in all these articles that you brought up, is that the one person who's loud enough gets the voice. And so I highly doubt that the entire dormitory or the entire, area felt that way. But if this one person is that fearful of somebody who's cisgender or a common maintenance guy to come and do a repair, I think that the conversation needs to be pointed back at them and say, why are you so fearful of this? Right.
Well, and you worked as a psychiatric nurse. I mean, doesn't this sound to you like there's a little mental health issue going on?
Or maybe we need to have a discussion of why you're so scared of having anyone enter your personal space, right? And if you are that afraid of it, maybe you shouldn't be at a public university where it's not truly your personal space.
Well said. Oh, yeah. And here's another one. I can't help myself, podcast listeners. There's another student. Quote, by the time I had come back, they appeared to be done, though Polo Man warned me that they would return later in the week to check the insulation. Sure enough, they were back the next day. I felt mildly violated and a little peeved. Polo Man. Name calling, right? Polo Man. Like a white dude wearing a polo shirt because he's trying to look semi-professional or professional because he is a plumber, which is a very honored profession, keeping these students warm. And this is what they're saying. I mean, I just don't understand what the heck's going on at these colleges and universities.
Yeah, it kind of makes me worry for them too, because it's, those are the kinds of people that end up becoming like a hermit in their own home later because they can't have anybody enter. And, it's like, I think that this is more of like a cry for help of like, I mean, good Lord, what it's tough for me to even concisely say something about it because this has less to do with the university and maintenance and being conscious of people's needs and more, what does this individual's mental health look like if you're that fearful of having somebody come in and do a maintenance repair, right? If they're on their own later and they need to have someone come and do electrical maintenance on their house or something like that, it's not realistic for them to call a company up and say, can you send out someone who's gay or someone who I'm more comfortable with? I say, no, we're just in the person that we have available, right?
Where did this term cisgender men come from? Why isn't it just like man? Why does it have to be? Because by definition, when my generation says man or woman, we automatically know what it means because it means what the word's definition is.
Yeah.
Why is there this new defined term, cisgender man?
Well, I think it's that because there have been so many other definitions and so many other classifications opening up for people that all of a sudden in those communities, there was no definition for someone who didn't fit those definitions. So it's almost like by default, you have to define the outlier. And
what is a cisgender man defined as?
Like a straight person.
A straight white guy?
Yeah.
Primarily? No, it doesn't have to be white.
It could be a cisgender male.
Transgender.
Yeah. So
not transgender.
It's someone who's attracted to the same sex. Or sorry, the opposite sex. So okay. I would be a cisgender male.
Okay. You're a cisgender male because you like women.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But a cisgender male wouldn't be a dude that likes guys.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because they don't
all these rules in your generation. I just don't understand. Like you're creating so many new rules. Well, why not just keep to the same old definitions? It just makes more sense.
Well, it's also just that like they don't. I mean, I'd be interested to see what the university sent them because they're also assuming that the plumbers or the people that are coming in to do these repairs are cisgender. And who's to say,
how would they know?
As a company, you can't hire someone and ask for their sexual preferences and things, So,
but that's what they're saying though.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Isn't that interesting? They're actually saying they want that they are encouraging discrimination of repair people based on their sexual identity.
Well, what if those workers weren't cisgender?
Bias, yes.
Yeah. I mean, they don't know that those workers weren't cisgender.
Yeah. Sounds to me like the workers were bullied, which is, of course, a key word in their community.
Yeah.
So next up, podcast listeners, Ted Cruz introduces a bill to bring immigrant processing centers where Democrat elites host their cocktail parties. Gotta say that again. Ted Cruz introduces a bill to bring immigrants who are crossing the border, the illegal immigrants, that is, and the processing centers that process them through into the U.S., into communities where the Democrats have their elite parties and really, really expensive houses. So Ted Cruz, the Republican from Texas, introduced a bill that would bring processing centers there. Fox News has reported this. By the way, this has also been reported by a number of other outlets, not just Fox News. Cruz blasted President Biden and his administration for having willingly surrendered the United States southern border to dangerous criminal cartels. He calls it the Surge Act, which is the Stop the Surge of Unsafe Rio Grande Encampments Act, typical Cruz. And so the bill effectively says that instead of processing these individuals on the Texas border as they're crossing the border from Mexico into Texas and Arizona and California, move the processing centers instead to Martha's Vineyard or to Bernie Sanders' hometown in Vermont or to Nancy Pelosi's community, where everybody has, of course, walls and gates. And that was Ted Cruz's idea. Look, I think this is part of the whole deplorable conversation that we've partly had during this podcast, which is the rules just don't apply to certain people in the United States.
Yeah. Where it's like, if you're going to be coming out with these policies, are you okay living with it if it affects your life directly? And it sounds like a lot of the politicians, even though they might be changing the policy or trying to do something that they feel might be good, they're not willing to live the lifestyle that affects. And so that's, I have to kind of laugh at that. Don't know that would ever end up happening, but but it sounds like he's kind of trying to force them to look it in the eye, right? If you're wanting to do this and move the policies in this direction, you need to live that lifestyle and be a part of it too. And they probably aren't willing to.
So what do millennials think about this whole idea of illegal immigration and the fact that the United States of America under Joe Biden and Democrat Congress, Democrat Senate and Democrat House of Representatives, the United States of America does not have borders? What do millennials think about that?
I think we do need to have borders. I think that there needs to be a process. I think that the process can be cleaned up and made better for people. I don't think that we need to cut out every single person from trying to come in and make a better life for themselves. But I don't think we need to switch to having open borders or letting every single person in that wants to come in.
So this is what's interesting. Like, I remember hearing for the first time, like 15 or 20 years ago, that, Democrats want a one world government. And I always thought to myself, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. No American citizen would want one world government, because that would make us homogenous, and we like the diversity. Well, and every country's different.
Yeah, well, they want one government as long as that aligns with what they want, right? And I think talking about Thomas Jefferson and writing the Declaration of Independence, you want to have different governments where if I don't agree with the politics in a certain state, I can move states. I can go somewhere that aligns with that. And if you remove that, that's kind of scary to me. It's actually very scary to me, because then you don't have any control, right? Then it's one government making decisions for every single person. And we already have a federal government trying to do that. And if we don't have the isolation in state governments where you can go somewhere that's more comfortable for you, which is probably why, I'm sure it'll come up later, people are leaving California and going to other places. If you don't have that, it ends up being bad.
But the Democrats would say, yeah, but people are leaving El Salvador and Honduras and Mexico, and they're coming to the United States. How is that any different? And what would you say?
How is it any different than having like a unified government?
How is it any different than people from, let's say, New York and California moving to the southern United States, or people from California moving to Montana, people from New York moving to North Carolina?
It's that it's a better place to go to. And I don't think that means that we need to change how many people we're letting in or how many immigrants we're allowing to enter the country. I think that we can, like I said, make that process more efficient and better for people that are trying to do it and open that up. I don't think we need to cut off the borders or anything like that.
See, I think it's really interesting that it's so foreign to me as an idea that we would just drop our borders and say that the United States is no longer a country. We are the country of North America. So Canada, United States, and Mexico become a single country, which I am convinced that's what they want.
Yeah.
And so then you ask yourself the question, well, what is it about Mexico that you want to emulate? What is it about Mexico that you think is just so fantastic that you want to bring to the United States and incorporate the entire country of Mexico into the US and copy because it's just so wonderful? What is it about the state? What is it about the country of Canada that's just so fantastic that you want to replicate it here in the United States?
Well, and would that really change the argument of having to manage people coming into the country, right? Let's say you were able to magically pull in Canada and Mexico and create this beautiful country. You're still going to have people trying to come there from worse situations. And so you'd still have the same problem to manage. And so, yeah, that's confusing to me. I mean, I think if they were able to maintain the similar structure in the US as what we've been able to do in the US of having individual state governments, it's not a problem. But when you look at that structured tier, it's not any different than having different countries. Like there's not really a point.
There's also this side of me too that says, look, your countries south of the border, agreed. I agree with you. They're messed up, and they're basically countries run by complete corrupt oligarchs, and you've got the narco oligarchs that are kind of in charge as well, and you can just go on and on and on. Well, why don't you fix your country?
Yeah.
Why don't you have a revolution in your country and fix it?
Yeah. Well, and what is our obligation to help with that? And it's a tough argument because I think
we give billions of dollars to these countries.
Right. And what's our obligation to continue doing that or continue to helping those people? And I'm not saying to throw it out, right? Because I genuinely do feel privileged to have been magically born in the US. It's a great life. I love my life. And other people are born into very bad situations.
No doubt.
I just think it's more complicated when you say what do we owe them and how would that affect us moving forward in the future?
But is it complicated to say that we shouldn't have a border and that we shouldn't? I mean, to me, that's not very complicated.
No, it's not. That part's not.
See, here's my one of my chief arguments, podcast listeners, and you'll appreciate this. I think you will too, Jonah. And that is, let's say, and you're uniquely in a position to understand this very well because of your family, which I won't go into, but let's just say we have about 1.2 million people that have crossed into the border since Joe Biden has been elected, which is probably about right. And your mom gets sick and has an emergency, and it's not COVID, has nothing to do with COVID. Your mom just gets sick and has an emergency, and that emergency is she has a heart attack or stroke. And you rush your parent to the hospital that you have been supporting for years by giving to all of their various fundraising drives to bring the most modern equipment into that hospital. You take your mother to the hospital because it's happening while you're already in the car. And you say, well, I'm just going to take her to the hospital myself. You take her to the hospital, you get to the emergency room, and there are 150 individuals in the emergency room, all of whom are here illegally and are using the emergency room for their primary care physicians and basically clogging up the hospital. And you say to yourself, well, wait a minute. You, the Democrats, are collapsing the medical system on purpose. And we, the American people who have built these fantastic hospitals, don't even get to use them.
Yeah.
And so I just don't understand how that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's not something that I'm on board for. I mean, you already see it going to hospitals, especially in big metropolitan areas. If you go to the ER, that's where I did a lot of my clinical rotations in Utah. And even there, where you don't have a large immigrant population, there are people that do not have the money, do not have the insurance to go, and they go to the ER for stomach aches and things like that.
And how is that going to be made better by having 1.2 million people, and probably by the time Joe Biden is out of office, it'll be millions more people who are using the emergency rooms across America in hospitals to get their primary care. And then we, the individuals who have built these great hospitals and these great institutions, are denied that care.
Yeah, well, it's not good. Maybe they're using it as a push to move towards
socialized medicine. No doubt in my mind. That's the plan.
We're already finishing each other's sentences.
Collapse the system. So get this, podcast listeners. You've heard the blank Joe Biden, the F Joe Biden chants across America. It's been primarily at college games, like college football games. And I don't think college basketball has started yet, right? Or is it just starting? So it'll be interesting to see if it happens at college basketball games as well. Right now, it's happening at college football games. And we've talked about this before. You know where it really hasn't happened, though, very much, and it hasn't been reported at least, is at professional sports games like baseball games or professional football games or professional soccer games, just go on and on and on. Well, guess what happened at the Atlanta Braves game? Professional team, right? Professional sports team, professional baseball. Well, they decided to chant, but they were more polite than the college students. They decided to do "Let's Go Brandon" instead of blank Joe Biden. We have that clip, and here it is.
Let's go Brandon! Let's go Brandon! Let's go Brandon!
So there you go. The "Let's Go Brandon." Very, very nice, though. You know, they're very polite, at least because they're not obviously using the...
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Like, I actually thought that they were chanting fuck Joe Biden when I first heard it. And I thought that somebody had just recorded it and then, put the text on there.
Like dubbed over top of it?
Yeah, to make it look like "Let's Go Brandon." But it's, it's also funny because it's like, I feel like in professional sports, you're not going off of people's first name, like when you're chanting or when you're calling out their name. So yeah, it's I think it makes the message pretty clear. Like that.
So what you're saying is the millennial heard two things. It heard "Let's Go Brandon," then it also heard the expletive "Let's blank Joe Biden" at the same time. Yeah. But maybe NBC News or whatever the mainstream news outlet was, they probably like dubbed it a little bit and was like, well, we can't do F Joe Biden. People will know what that means, but they won't necessarily know what "Let's Go Brandon" means.
Yeah. I would find it hard to believe that an entire stadium would be chanting "Let's Go Brandon."
Can you imagine being president of the United States and having stadium after stadium, now professional stadiums, professional sports stadiums, and having people say this about you? Yeah. How embarrassing. Yeah. I mean, I just can't imagine. I would want to step down just right there.
Yeah, that's a lot.
I mean, actually, you know what? What would be really ballsy is if Joe Biden went to one of these stadiums and he like had to throw out the first ball, and then wait a minute. I thought the president was supposed to throw out the first ball at baseball season. But yeah, I guess this started afterwards.
Somebody probably smartly advised him not.
That's right, because usually it's the Baltimore Orioles or the Washington Nationals that he does that, because those stadiums are close to Washington, D.C. So apparently that didn't happen. I'm sure that's why. Interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to have to find that because this would be pretty awesome.
That would be pretty bad if the whole stadium started cheering that when he was out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. Dum 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 dum. And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is California bans gas-powered lawn equipment. Yes, you heard that correctly, podcast listeners. The state of California is banning gas-powered lawn equipment because, that's what your priority is when everybody's trying to leave your state. Here's CBS 8 San Diego reporting on the actual bill. We have that clip, and here it is.
Carla, thanks. California is banning the sale of new gas leaf blowers. Governor Gavin Newsom signed a law banning the sale of new gas-powered off-road engines like leaf blowers and lawnmowers.
So that is the actual explanation of CBS 8 in San Diego about what the bill actually kind of sort of does. But here is the owner of Blitz Lawn Equipment. This is also CBS 8 San Diego reporting. But here's the owner of Blitz Lawn Equipment who sells these gas-powered lawnmowers and leaf blowers and so forth. He's talking about how this is going to affect his business in the state of California. We have that clip, and here it is.
Casey Bliss owns Bliss Power Lawn Equipment. He's working with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District to offer money in exchange for old gas-powered equipment.
We saw that this was coming down the road. We see battery as becoming more and more commonplace.
But not commonplace enough.
I don't know of a battery-powered rototiller. I don't know of a chainsaw larger than a 20-inch bar that's battery-powered. So not quite sure how CAL FIRE and some of those type of things are going to go out there and mitigate fires when they have to have battery-powered.
Yeah, so that's the gentleman who owns Blitz Lawn Equipment, and he makes the point that, CAL FIRE is the organization, very large one, that cuts down trees to try to block the fires from spreading in California. And they use, of course, gas-powered chainsaws. And the question he has is, well, how are you going to get the amount of power that you need from an electric battery for a actual chainsaw? And when you want to till your garden, or you want to till an area that you want to plant a lot of, kind of rose bushes or whatever else you want to plant, your tiller, there's no such thing at the moment as a tiller that has actually a battery. They're all gas powered. So how do you do that? Just like suddenly you pass a bill, you're going to ban gas-powered lawn equipment, and then the next day, what happens?
Yeah, because I think they're banning like the future sales of it, and I think the biggest argument against it is on the commercial level, right? People that need this for firefighting, that need it for their lawn businesses. The battery tech that's available, I don't think it's a problem to shift away from gas-powered motors from a supply standpoint for people's homes, like a home lawnmower or something like that. But when you're talking about needing to rely on a chainsaw and high heat and crazy demands that are on it in those situations, the battery tech is just not there to even run these tools and run this equipment.
And podcast listeners, you have to understand, Jonas Small, who is a millennial, actually is in this industry. He's in the renewable energy business, specifically battery technology.
Yeah,
so he knows what he's talking about.
So I worked for a company that makes batteries for home use and for business use, and looking at, even just the energy density that these can provide and what products are already out there. Is it possible that there could be a company that comes up from this that then supplies that demand? Yes. But in terms of supply chain and manufacturing and being able to have equipment that works all the time, I think they're going to run into a lot of problems.
So to be fair, too, California did just pass this bill,
right?
The ban of gas-powered lawn equipment, but it doesn't go into fully in effect until 2024.
Yeah.
In which case you cannot buy any of this kind of lawn equipment anymore, anything that has to do with gas-powered lawn equipment, which means you're probably going to have a hard time, not just finding it, obviously, but having it repaired. And I'm pretty sure you aren't going to be able to necessarily use it probably in 5 to 10 years, because then they're going to just say, no, you can't even use it, even if you have it and it still works.
Right.
So then what happens? 2024 comes, you need a tiller.
Yeah.
Because you're in the landscaping business. There's no electric generated tiller to till the soil. Then what?
That's a great question. There's going to have to be some company that rises from the depths to find solutions for this, because there's not one right now. Like the power demands that are from that, you could slap a big battery in the back of your truck, but now you're losing space for your other equipment, and they're not cheap. Like being able to provide a battery that stores enough power for all of your lawn equipment for your business is so expensive, and there's no way that people are going to be able to purchase that. So it would be really interesting to see where this shifts. I get the impression that it's going to have to be edited later on. It's going to have to be.
Well, that's what's so funny about this. They pass these bills. They're so virtuous, and they pass them. And then, at some point, the governor is going to have to sign some sort of executive order to delay the implementation because of the fact that it's not ready. Proof. Here's proof, podcast listeners. We have KCRA News reporting. This is another clip about this issue. We're going to talk about actually this immediately after the clip. How about the pandemic and what it's doing to the supply chain? We have that clip, and here it is.
Yeah, it's a little frustrating, but it's kind of out of our hands. Nothing we can do about it.
Werner tells me he's not fazed by the governor's decision and is more focused now on keeping business going during the pandemic.
Each week there's a new category that's got a shortage or a price increase, and we just try to react as quick as we can.
And we know that stores can continue selling gas-powered equipment past 2024 if they still have them in stock.
So if they still have the gas-powered equipment in stock because they bought it, they can sell it after 2024. But obviously the whole idea is to stop these individuals from even buying gas-powered equipment and putting them in their stores so people won't buy it. But if you don't have a replacement for it, you can't buy it. And then you have this gentleman who owns a store who's saying, well, with the pandemic, we can't even get stuff that's being manufactured to put on the shelves, not because people are buying so much of it, but because not enough of it is being made.
Yeah.
So California puts this law in place during a pandemic.
Yeah. Well, and what runs an electric device? You need chips, you need electronic components that are also running out of stock everywhere. You have electricians not being able to get the parts that they need or the quality of the parts they need. I'm sure everyone's seen, right, the automotive industry, the chip shortages and things like that. And
Absolutely.
So you're going to run into even worse of a supply chain issue if you're trying to all of a sudden pour in all these new devices.
How about the grid constantly going down in California? If you have to keep recharging everything in California at your house, you got to recharge your car, you got to recharge your truck, you got to recharge all of the lawn equipment. You have to recharge, the go-kart that your kids want to use and ride on the street, or the golf cart or whatever that is. But you have the grid that constantly is unreliable in California because California is saying you can't generate electricity from natural gas. You can't generate electricity from anything other than renewables. What the heck? It's like a third world country then.
Well, and even the fires that we talked about in California, the utility companies have to shut the lines down periodically just to avoid the risk of fires. And so, they've done different state incentives trying to push batteries into people's homes to make it easier for everybody. But I think with the population leaving California and there not being enough money to put, how do you tell everyone in California that you have to have a battery in their house and then not help them pay for it? And who's paying for it?
Yeah.
And so you run into a big logistical nightmare of trying to mandate that everything is battery powered and electronic when the market's not there to support that.
So here's the big question for millennials. So California passes this gas-powered ban for lawn equipment. And of course, California has done the similar things for gas cars as well. So for the millennials, I mean, there's no doubt that you guys want, a cleaner planet and all that stuff. And I think everybody wants that. But do millennials understand that when bills like this are passed and you don't have the technology really ready for prime time, that you're putting tons of people out of work? And that at the same time, you're making things worse and you're taking advantage of a pandemic when people are the weakest.
Yeah.
Do millennials understand those nuances, or are they just, as a general principle? I know millennials tend to be diverse, of course, but not necessarily so much on political issues.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And it's tough all around because, I think California tries to come out and make a lot of these policies and they end up being this testing ground for the rest of the US because they throw out these absurd policies where all of a sudden you can't have a gas car, you can't have a lawnmower, and I think it's a separate argument for me to say, well, can you even tell me that I can't purchase a gas powered leaf blower? Like, that's kind of interesting to me, on its own topic.
Well, what I want to see is this. I want to see Gavin Newsom one day driving his electric car and then, getting like halfway to his destination. The car is like quickly running out of electricity. The battery, the charge is running out, and then the grid goes down. And then he tries to stop and to recharge it, and he can't because the grid is down. And then finally, I mean, that would just be epic. That's what needs to happen for these idiots, because that they're not in any way, shape, or form following their own rules. That they're always going to be, there are going to be exceptions in these rules and laws for them. They will never be accountable for them.
Yeah, and they're making changes, but I think some of the problem is they're trying to make all these changes at once, right? Where it's like you need the infrastructure to be able to back up the policies that you're putting out, right? So if you make these policies where people can't have gas-powered cars and people can't have gas-powered equipment, there's not the infrastructure there to even support that monetarily or in terms of providing battery backup and solar-powered, utility power from the grid. Right. And
exactly.
So they're kind of doing it all at once. And I think that there's no way this is going to happen. It's going to have to be pushed back or edited or changed later. There's no way they're going to be able to implement this and not put hundreds of thousands of people out of business or have them continue leaving California.
There you go. And that's the last word for Mark and the Millennials. And that's the dumbest bill in America. California bans gas-powered lawn equipment. Thank you for joining Mark and Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Thank you to Jonah Small, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.